I just got back from shooting another professional soccer game and I tested something today. I rented this beast of a lens. This is the Canon RF 100-500. It has its pros, it has its cons, but we're talking about a bunch of things. The build of it and the range of the zoom and things I like and don't like, how I felt about the variable aperture, the autofocus, its comparisons and how it lines up to the 70-200 and another lens, and then a bunch of stuff in between there. Starting out with the build. The build of this lens is awesome. It's actually really lightweight. It's a big lens, don't get me wrong, but these RF mount lenses that are coming out from Canon are really, really nice whenever you need to carry them around and travel with them. This compared to the 400mm lens, well, it's gonna be so much lighter. There's one thing that I don't really love about the build, but it's also why it's so light and compact. Look at how far this thing zooms out. That is insane. So it doesn't have the internal zoom like the 70-200 EF version will have. This thing starts as small as it can get and just gets larger. Pause. I was not crazy about this at first, but as I continued to use it, I really didn't mind it. Definitely takes some getting used to if you're going to use it on a tripod because the weight gets different. If you're going to throw this thing on a stabilizer, more power to you. Don't think it's a great idea, but you're definitely going to have to maybe balance it at like the 250 mark, so then you have it in between. That would just be a bad idea. The reason I say 250 is because you see how the numbers get closer together at the 400 or 500 mark. You want it to be in the middle of the weight. But all in all, the build of this, it feels very solid. It feels nice in hand. These RF mount lenses are as good as it gets, and I think overall they feel nicer than the EF lenses. Next up, let's talk about the range and the zoom. So this is a 100-500mm lens. That, like I mentioned, means that it zooms out very far and comes back very far. But the range itself was very, very nice to have. I have experience with the 70-200. I have experience shooting the NFL photos with a 400-8. This right here kind of covers that whole range. For video, it's going to be a great lens to have. I like that 100-500 because if they get close to you, you're good at that 100. But if they're on the opposite side of the field, like you see during the soccer game, this is on the totally opposite side and I can still get a pretty good shot. That's not possible with the 70-200, and that's why this focal length was so enticing to me. One of the cool features that it has on top of the crazy zoom is for the video shooters. So how smooth do you want it to be? One of the things that I've noticed throughout the livelihood of my 24-70 that I use all the time is that the zoom has gotten a little bit looser. So it's a little bit smoother whenever I want a slow zoom. I'm not on a cinema lens, so it's not really meant to be a slow zoom. They're photo lenses technically, but one thing that Canon took into effect here was something I've never seen before. Right here you see these two words and a little arrow between them. This is a dial, and no, it's not the control ring like all these RF lenses have. The control rings down here that I'm a big fan of. This right here says smooth on one end and tight on the other. So what it does is whenever you have it on smooth, it makes it a lot easier to zoom up and zoom out. Whenever you put it on tight, makes it harder to go up and back. So whatever your preference is, you can get it dialed in perfectly. You can also go in between if you think one's too tight, one's too loose. So you can go in between and get that nice smooth zoom. So for those video people, if you're trying to get that nice pull back or that nice push in without it being all herky-jerky, Canon took that into effect, and that is one of my favorite things and one of the most unique things about this. Now you hear me saying that this is a great lens for video. One of the reasons this is not a great photo lens is because of the variable aperture. Let's talk about the aperture, and this is the elephant in the room when it comes to a lens like this. So this right here is a f4.5 to 7.1 lens. So that meaning at 100mm, you can have the aperture at 4.5, but at 500mm, it's at 7.1. 7.1 is way too narrow and not going to allow any light into your camera. It's going to be very tough to shoot photos at a night game whenever it's dark out. You're going to try and have your shutter at least 1/500, which I still think is slow for sports, and you're going to be pumping your ISO. The nice thing about video is that if you're shooting in 120 frames per second, your shutter only has to be at 250. Maybe you're shooting 4K 60, so it has to be at 1/125. So you're going to be able to work with it a lot more in the video world for these night games. Still going to probably have to pump that ISO, but you can keep that shutter lower, allowing the camera to let in a lot more light without creating it artificially with the ISO. This is the worst part of the lens, but it's also the reason that the lens even exists and the reason that it's at the price point that it's at. This lens is $2,699, which might sound expensive, but that is a great deal for a lens of this nature. These long focal length lenses are very expensive. And one that we're going to talk about later is the 100-300 f2.8 that just came out. And that thing is so expensive. So this is a great middle ground for you sports and nature photographers and videographers, mostly videographers, because you can't really pump your ISO that much in photo while keeping that shutter speed high. Overall, the variable aperture just isn't a great feature. I don't love it. Ideally, you have a fixed aperture, but I don't want it to be fixed at 7.1. But how while shooting videos, I pretty much had it fixed at 7.1. I don't want it to be at 4.5 and have my settings all dialed in and then zoom in and just see my image get darker. That's just a hard thing to deal with in the edit after the fact. So what I found myself doing a lot was keeping the aperture at 7.1 no matter what focal length I was at. Whenever I was at 100 millimeter, it was at 7.1. Whenever I was at 500 millimeters, it was at 7.1, so that I didn't have to change my settings while I was actually shooting. You might think there's less depth of field since you're at 7.1, but with a lens like this, there's so much compression at 500 millimeter that realistically you could be shooting at 500 millimeter at f20 and you're still gonna have some depth of field. No, it's not as buttery as the f2.8, but you're still gonna have that separation between the subject and the background. So you don't have to be worried about that. Next, let's talk about my favorite thing about these RF lenses, the autofocus. The autofocus for these is unbelievable. For the autofocus, I'm really comparing it pretty heavily to this trusty 70-200 that I own. This is the lens that I would have been using if I didn't rent this 100-500. But the RF 100-500's autofocus is just a whole lot better because I don't have the lens on a converter. This lens is native for my Canon R5. That meaning that I don't need a converter between my lens and the camera. I just have the lens that is designed for my camera directly on my camera, so all of the functions that the camera can do are going to be done to the best of its ability. The autofocus is great, except for whenever you go like this. Whenever you have it on smooth, which I had it on pretty much all night, and then you go very quick and very far back and very quick. When you jump it like that, it just isn't that great and it searches a little bit. But if you go slowly zoom in, slowly zoom out, your autofocus is going to lock to whatever your subject is on or whatever you're trying to get it to focus on. The only problem is whenever you go quickly, but typically you don't need focus whenever you go quickly. Typically you're trying to switch up your shot. So let's compare this to lenses that you might be thinking about as well. Let's talk 100-500, 70-200, and then the new 100-300 f2.8. So these are three lenses that are great options for the sports and nature scene. Any of the settings that you're going to need a telephoto lens. As I mentioned, the 100-500 comes in at $2,699. If you like a lightweight setup and you're shooting during the day primarily, I think this is your go-to lens. If you shoot some sports but you want a lens that's versatile for other settings, I think this is going to be your go-to. Now, I'm not going to recommend this. We're going to talk about the RF version that I don't personally have, but the RF version comes in at $1,799, and that is going to be good for more than just sports and nature. I use it for photography, and it's just a really nice lens to have in your kit. It's part of that holy trinity, and you're gonna really want this lens. So I still recommend the 70-200. But then the third one is that 100-300 f2.8. This lens is amazing if you have all the money in the world. It's $9,499, and that's just very expensive for a lens that's going to be so similar to a 70-200. Yes, it solves the problems that we have here where it's a fixed aperture and it's a little bit longer of a focal length, but it's so expensive that I don't think it's realistic to really recommend. Overall, this lens is going to be amazing for you sports and nature photographers and videographers, mostly videographers, filmmakers, whatever you want to call them. I really enjoyed it. This is something that I would consider actually purchasing myself because it's not a super high price point, and if I'm going to be shooting a lot of sports, this is going to be a great lens to have. Thank you for watching. If you're not subscribed already, please subscribe and like this video. I know it means nothing to you, but it helps me a lot. And as always, here are some of my favorite photos from throughout the week.